Hi everyone, today's video we are going to be focusing on biomass and its use to create biofuels. So this specifically relates to the dot point, the use and application of anaerobic fermentation of biomass for biofuel production. So a couple of new words here. We're looking at biomass and biofuel production. We should already be familiar with the words anaerobic fermentation, as we would have covered this in our previous video on anaerobic respiration. So in unpacking this dot point, we're going to be addressing the following success criteria. So by the end of this video, you should be able to identify what biomass is. You should be able to explain how biomass can be used to produce biofuel. And you should also be able to explain how anaerobic fermentation can be used to produce biofuel. So let's start with the basics. What is biomass? So you can see on the screen here, we've got a number of examples in the image, but basically what biomass is we're looking at any of the organic matter that has come from a living organism. So for example, the wood from trees, it might be the leftover husks from corn from our crop fields, or the offshoots of wheats, any vegetable oils or animal fats. We've got our poop happening here, animal manure and sewage as well as anything else that we can find in our trash or garbage that has originated from living things. So why is biomass so important? Why are we interested in it? Well, believe it or not, because this particular substance has come from a living thing, we know that it is going to contain stored energy that hasn't been used. And that's what we want to take advantage of. So when we break down biomass through a series of different chemical reactions, we're actually able to access that stored energy and use it so that humans can benefit. So we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at that now. So, like I was saying, biomass is going to be used to generate, or we're going to unlock that stored energy in our biomass, and that is how we create our biofuels. So there are a number of different chemical reactions and different processes that can occur to result in us producing some biofuels. Some example of biofuels to make you aware of what they are. Things like bioethanol, so this is the one that your study design specifically wants you to know about. Biodiesel and biogas. So each one of those fuel sources has originated from biomass being broken down in a different chemical reaction to produce that end product. So for example, if we look at the diagram on the right of the screen here, we can see that if we are to use microalgae, okay, so a living organism to undergo anaerobic fermentation, for example, this microalgae might be able to use some lipids or fats through a chemical process, and the resulting product is biodiesel, which we can then use to make diesel, which powers a lot of our machinery. Okay, the specific example that we're going to be looking at is how we can use the process of anaerobic fermentation to break down sugars and produce that bioethanol. So let's take a closer look at that now. So scientists are taking advantage of the fact that we can use microorganisms that undergo anaerobic fermentation to produce ethanol to help us convert our biomass into something like bioethanol. So the sorts of organisms that scientists would be using to perform this process, where we're trying to use our biomass and we want our end product to be bioethanol, we're going to be picking organisms that will undergo anaerobic fermentation, and we know the end product of fermentation in those organisms is ethanol. So for example, we might select a bacteria, a fungi, or an algae that we know when it undergoes anaerobic fermentation, where there is no oxygen present or a very low oxygen environment, ethanol will be the resulting product. So the way scientists will do this, if you look at the diagram on the right hand side here, please don't feel that you need to memorize this, you absolutely don't. This is sort of there to paint a picture for those of you who are a little bit more visually inclined. So we've got our biomass starting here, okay? That biomass we end up treating in a chemical plant for pre-treatment, and it will end up in a series of vats, which is shown in the middle of the diagram here. While it's in those vats, we add in those microorganisms such as bacteria, fungi, or algae, and we incubate them at their ideal temperature in a really oxygen poor environment. That way that we know these particular organisms are going to use the biomass to undergo anaerobic fermentation rather than aerobic respiration. So undergoing anaerobic fermentation, where ethanol is produced, and at the end of that process they will distill out that ethanol, purify it, and we can then use that to create our biofuels such as the bioethanol. In the specific example of producing bioethanol, if we think about this logically, if we are wanting to produce ethanol as a product and we want to use the process of anaerobic fermentation to produce ethanol as a product, we know that for our organisms to undergo anaerobic fermentation, they need to start with a sugar. Okay, so usually when scientists are trying to take advantage of this process, they're going to select biomass that has a high sugar content. So for example, corn or sugarcane, so the leftovers from the crops that farmers are using in corn or sugarcane fields, that is a great example of a biomass that is high in sugar that would be used in this process to make sure that we're getting, I guess, the biggest bang for our buck, so to speak. At the end of that process of anaerobic fermentation, where the bioethanol is distilled at the end, that bioethanol can then be used to produce our fuel sources that we use to power, I guess, everything really. Okay, an example that most of you will probably be familiar with is like the E10 ethanol petrol that you find at your petrol stations. So that has been produced because it contains 10% bioethanol. At the moment in Australia, I think at some petrol stations, not all, you can find E85. So that's an ethanol that is a fuel that is 85% bioethanol, which is kind of cool. So why are biofuels, I guess, a topic of conversation these days? Well, it's because they're defined as a renewable energy source. And what they mean by a renewable energy source, it's not because they're limitless. It's because we know that to produce this biofuel, we're breaking down biomass, and the production of biomass is always going to occur. Remember, biomass is where we have a particular organism that might have died, or we're getting rid of that waste product or whatever it is from that particular living organism, forming the biomass, and then we're providing that biomass to microscopic organisms that will perform anaerobic fermentation, break it down to produce ethanol, which we can then use to power whatever it is we want to power, usually via combustion, so setting it on fire. In that process of combustion, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, and obviously, as we know, plants are really good at absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and using that carbon dioxide to create those glucose sugar molecules again, so that carbon dioxide will be reabsorbed by the plants here, and the cycle sort of begins again. Okay, so when they refer to it as a renewable energy source, it's because this cycle will continue for as long as we need it to. The plants will absorb the carbon dioxide, the plants will eventually become biomass, we'll use that biomass to create the bioethanol, we'll burn the bioethanol via combustion, which releases the carbon dioxide back into the air, and then a fresh set of plants will absorb that carbon dioxide again, and the cycle just continues. Some things that you might want to be mindful of with regards to the topic of biomass and biofuels is right now this technology is a very inefficient process, so there definitely does still need to be some refinement done before this becomes, I guess, a primary source of fuel for society. Other things that we need to be mindful of also would be if we're talking about things like corn and sugarcane, those sorts of crops obviously require a very large amount of space to be able to grow and harvest them. So we need to be mindful of how much land we actually need to produce a sustainable level of bioethanol so that it can fuel our society. We're talking about millions and millions of hectares here, so a lot of room. And then the other thing that you also might want to be aware of is we're talking about these, I guess what would have naturally been a food source, corn and sugarcane, as now a fuel source. So there's that consideration of, is this fuel or is it food? And also being mindful of how that might impact other people in society as well. As always, if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to your teacher and ask those questions. Have a great day, everyone.